Hello, welcome to Beastly Theories. This is Andy McGrath, your host. Today, I've got Gary Opit with me. Now, he's a wildlife expert, environmental consultant for the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, radio station 94.5 FM, North Coast, New South Wales, and has a regular weekly show which has been running for 22 years, where he tackles subjects like wildlife behaviour, current issues concerning the environment of the North Coast. On his show, he also takes listeners' calls and must immediately identify all species of mammals, birds, reptiles, amphibians, and invertebrates from their descriptions. He's the author of Australian Cryptozoology, and he's also written many academic pieces. He's an environmental consultant with a field research and public relations career spanning 50 years, working in New South Wales, Queensland, Papua New Guinea, and Southeast Asia. Expert on vegetation and fauna survey techniques, plant identification of ecology of terrestrial vertebrate fauna groups, vegetation classification, vegetation mapping, plant conservation biology, and wildlife habitat management. He also lectures university and high school students on botany, zoology, biogeography, Australian ecology, permaculture, Aboriginal ecology, religion, and culture. Gary, what a wonderful mouthful of a unique CV. How are you? Welcome to the show.
I am very fine and lovely to talk with you, Andy, and Beasts of Britain tonight.
Thank you so much. Now, there's so much in the book which you kindly sent me quite a while back, and I did look through quite a bit of it. Now, there's a unique, I suppose, ecosystem there in Australia. You've got a unique set of animals anyway that we know about. But you talked about something in the book that was very interesting to me, which was 10 species of large mammals that were unknown to science that were repeatedly reported to you by listeners on your radio program. Can you describe these 10 species for us?
Yes, I can, and I'll show you some illustrations as well.
Oh,
wow. I've been a scientific member of the Royal Zoological Society of New South Wales for 45 years, and in 2013 they decided to hold a zoological forum on dangerous ideas in zoology. Now, they hold a zoological forum every year, and every year it's a different topic. It can be on dingoes or flying foxes or kangaroos or koalas, a whole array of different subjects. And I thought, well, what a wonderful opportunity to speak to Australia's top 100 scientists at the Australian Museum in Sydney, because they wanted really dangerous ideas. And so there was about 30 speakers, perhaps. Each had 15 minutes. And then when it was my turn at about 2:15 in the afternoon, I said, now, you may have thought that some of the ideas you've heard are dangerous, but wait till you hear mine. And then I described how I'd been broadcasting this federally funded radio program on ABC, North Coast, New South Wales local radio, wildlife identification. And people phone in, I have to instantly identify everything that they've seen, which I can do. I've always done fauna and flora surveys. And so I didn't really expect to receive any reports on unknown animals, because even though I picked up many reports of such animals, and even seen on very, very rare occasions, I saw one animal unknown to science, and I heard the calls of one or two different species of animals unknown to science, but it was a bit hard to believe that anything was actually out there, because I was, like most people, pretty sure that it was highly unlikely anything could survive and not be known to modern science. And so I was really surprised by the number of phone calls that I received and emails describing around about 10 different species of animals. So my presentation at the end of the day was awarded as the bravest, most dangerous presentation. And it was interesting because the gathered zoologists stated that this was the first time a light had been shone on these amazing reports that are received. And one of the zoologists said that we all receive these reports, but no one does anything about them. But actually recorded the name of the person, the locality, the description, and the behaviour of the animal, and the identification. And so I've received over 22 years, every week of the year, pretty much, thousands of phone calls and emails and photographs sent on the ABC North Coast local radio Facebook site, photographs of birds and insects and lizards and snakes and everything for identification. Of those thousands of phone calls, I was able to identify about 400 different species of animals. That included invertebrates, insects, spiders, etc. But I'd also received several hundred phone calls and emails, sometimes live on air, of animals completely unknown to science. And so I'll go through those. But anyway, the Royal Zoological Society produces a journal, the Australian Zoologist. It's the oldest zoological journal in Australia. It's been going for over 100 years. And so my paper, the first on citizen science and cryptozoology, was published in 2017. That's, I'm just showing you, that's the cover of it.
Awesome.
That's the cover. And then I'll just show you that's my article. I'm just seeing how it looks, my scientific article. It's about 30, 40 pages. And I've actually got it up on my Facebook site, Australian Cryptozoology, Gary Opit. And so, I mean, I received lots of phone calls on very rare and endangered species such as the spotted-tailed quoll and the brush-tailed phascogale. They're carnivorous marsupials related to Tasmanian tigers. But the largest number of reports I received was on a Tasmanian tiger or thylacine-like animal. Now, the thylacine or thylacine cynocephalus, is a carnivorous marsupial related to Tasmanian devils, spotted-tailed quolls, carnivorous marsupials. And so it's not related to a tiger or a dog or anything. It's an example of parallel evolution. So the Australian continent has been isolated from the rest of the world for about 50 million years, and was originally part of the Great Gondwana land supercontinent that included Australia joined to Antarctica, with New Zealand part of the Australian east coast, and South America, Africa, even India, Madagascar. When that broke apart and Australia began drifting north at about 6 centimetres a year, flowing north from currents of white hot liquid rock about 100 kilometres below our feet, the Australian animals were isolated from the rest of the world's fauna and flora, but they're related to the South American animals and the animals that lived in Gondwana. So we also have plants that are related to the proteus in South Africa. So we have a remarkable ecosystem, or a variety of ecosystems, that are incredibly ancient, but of course the animals, even though they're unbelievably ancient, they're extremely modern. They're highly adapted to survive. So we have a range of spectacular animals, some surviving, some species surviving from the Devonian. We have the Queensland lungfish, which was the first first backbone animal to breathe air, atmosphere, oxygen, and it was one of the earliest animals to move on land. They're still living in the rivers completely unchanged. The fossil skeletons of them are exactly the same as they are today, 300 million years later. Then we've got the platypus and the echidna, which are egg-laying mammals, and they're virtually mammal-like reptiles. You know, they're the platypus, for instance. We've got fossils going back 120 million years. So the platypus lived with dinosaurs, and then 66 million years after the dinosaurs succumbed, the platypus is still swimming around the feet of people today. We've got the world's largest butterflies, the world's largest moths, we've got an incredible array of animals, mainly marsupials. And one of the most remarkable is the Tasmanian tiger, or thylacine, or thylacine. And when Europeans arrived around about 200 or so years ago, English settlements in 1788 spread across the continent. Tasmanian tigers and devils were found primarily in Tasmania, which has been isolated from Australia for about something like 6,000 to 8,000 years, they believe. But a few specimens were apparently shot and observed on the mainland, but it was generally believed that the Tasmanian tiger went extinct in 1936, and that was from a disease primarily, which decimated the populations. Tasmanian tigers, or thylacines, were very difficult animals to observe or even trap. Just like any carnivore, they're an ambush predator, and they're not easy to see. Though when they were common, they were seen occasionally. But most Tasmanian trappers, trapping for the fur trade, majority of them only trapped one or two Tasmanian tigers or Tasmanian wolves or Tasmanian dogs in their whole career. And they were wonderful animals. They're introduced to captivity. They used to be shown in wild animal show, in dogs. They were sold in agricultural shows, and they were distributed around the world. They were in zoos for a long time, all over the world, including London Zoo and zoos in America and Europe and Asia. But this disease went through the marsupials, and the Tasmanian thylacine declined dramatically, and so it's generally believed to be extinct since 1936. However, ever since, there are many, many reports of the animals seen alive that's still coming in to this day, but there's no hard physical evidence. But as well as that, we've received many reports of it on the mainland as well, and that was the animal that I received the most number of reports of. By these days, around about 100 reports. And I mean, and this is in northeastern New South Wales, and so these reports are of often multiple witnesses observing these animals, listening to them call. One banana farmer and his workmen, including a teacher who was working on his school holidays at a banana farm, they encountered this animal, and they chased it up the hill. Yeah, they had no idea what it was. To them, it was a monster because it was unlike anything they'd seen. But multiple observations and reports, including reports by zoologists. Dr. Mary Gardner saw an animal look just like a thylacine or Tasmanian tiger at Cape Byron and on the most easterly point in Australia. So
were they solitary animals when they were in
Yes,
existence?
no, they're always solitary animals. So just like normal carnivores, just like leopards or other ambush predators. So they look dog-like, but they're not pursuit predators. So they don't chase their prey. They don't have the bone structure of a predator, of a canine, a dog or a wolf. Their limb structure is similar to a cat, and so it's believed they could even climb trees, but they could definitely jump like a kangaroo, rise up on their hind legs and jump like a kangaroo, or run like a dog. Brown in colour with black stripes, and you can see illustrations I've got.
I see that. Yes.
So a wonderful animal, and they were generally, at one time they had a bounty on their head because it was believed that they were killers of sheep. However, so zoologists studying the records of the sheep stations that recorded every demise of every sheep found there was no reports of thylacines or Tasmanian tigers ever attacking sheep, and the studies of their jaws have shown that they only fed on small prey like rats and possums, and other small animals, small wallabies, very tiny kangaroos, animals like that. And yeah, that like any predator, they'd have a very large territory because obviously they have to hunt prey, and so they move around their territories, just like any predator. And of course, they're extremely cryptic because they don't want to be seen by their prey species, and so they're regularly observed by people all over Australia. But most people, if they're lucky enough to see one, and they're mainly farmers and forestry workers and rural workers and dwellers, mainly seen crossing the road at night from a car. Sometimes seen in the daytime by farmers driving tractors, or by forestry workers driving through the state forests. But they might only see one or two in a lifetime. Like you have to be very fortunate to cross paths with one of these animals. So that's probably why we don't have any physical evidence of them. But hundreds of reports.
That seems very logical, really. But you're saying that these are on the mainland of Australia, which is a place that they weren't even known to inhabit before their extinction. Is that right?
No. There were many species of thylacine that have evolved in Australia, and they lived in every part of Australia, and they found fossils in every part of Australia, including New Guinea. When I was living in New Guinea, I used to work with the Wow Ecology Institute, which is the field station of the Bishop Museum of Hawaii. This is in 1973-74. I talked to a zoologist that had actually seen a Tasmanian tiger or thylacine cross the road up at between Wow and Balolo in the Owen Stanley Ranges, and there was reports of missionaries seeing them in the western end of Indonesian section of New Guinea. So, and New Guinea, like, it's completely undisturbed. Mostly, and so they're probably happily living there. But the chance of encountering one of these animals or actually collecting one somehow is very remote. Yeah.
And about the other 9 species that people would call in about, what was the second most frequent call that you received about unknown large mammals?
The second most common is probably, and this is the most astounding species, it's probably Homo erectus. So it's either Homo erectus or Homo denisovans, and it's the animal that's generally known as a Bigfoot and the Sasquatch. It seems very, very similar in every way. Also known as the Yeti. In the Himalayas, and the Yeren in China, and it's got a variety of names. So I've received literally dozens of reports, and reports continue to come in, very detailed reports, and the animal stands around about between 5.5 to 7 feet in height.
Wow.
And it's very powerfully built, and we may have more than one species. It's difficult to know, but generally it has a very human-like face. So when people have close views of them, they say that it's not a gorilla, it's not an ape, it's a human. It's got a face like a very ugly human. They describe the face as very much like a Neanderthal. Illustrations of cavemen and Neanderthals. That's what comes to mind. They're very solid, covered in hair, and the hair, they vary in colour. They can be all black, they can be brown, or they can be a blonde haired, so sort of a very pale brown, almost orange. So quite a variety of colours, but black or black with silver hairs might be elderly ones, but males and females, and of course the encounters are usually traumatic because majority of Australians are completely ignorant of the existence of these things, and because, like most people, most Australians, they're city dwellers today and they're suburbanites, and their only interaction with wildlife is in picnic areas or in wildlife parks.
Yeah.
And so when they encounter something like this in the bush, which happens quite frequently, the results are pretty astounding. People absolutely amazed and shocked to encounter something like this. Very powerful animals. Well, really,
I suppose that's part of the trauma-like response. Essentially, is that the witness feels threatened, or that they could be harmed by such a large creature, whether the creature makes any threatening gestures or not.
Yes.
Yeah. Now, talking about the Yowie, I think you call it, don't you? Talking about the Yowie, what are the most typical descriptions that are given in interactions with people? Where are they most regularly witnessed? Is it normally accidental, or is the creature curious in seeking out or observing people, or a mix of all those things?
Yes, look, it's a mix. So mostly it's accidental. However, they're increasing in number. So the reports are coming in all the time, all over Australia. And it's astounding how many reports are coming in. And now, like a perfect example, a woman by the name of Sarah contacted me. This happened some time back in Victoria, Mornington Peninsula, near Melbourne. She was driving back from, I think she was a nurse or she worked late at night. She was driving back home at about 2 or 3 in the morning, and she came across 2 large animals in the middle of the road, thickly furred animals. And she was thinking, God, it must be gigantic. It was dogs or giant kangaroos. And she drove right up to them. It was a full moon, and and they're in the full headlights, and they're right in front of a car, and she's looking at them, and one looks at her, and she gets the shock of her life, because she realizes, to her it looked like a yeti, and it was definitely a female. It had quite an attractive face, like it was definitely a woman's face or a female face, but not a human woman, probably a Homo erectus woman, thickly furred. And she was absolutely astounded, and she thought they have to be kangaroos. They can't be. There's no yetis here. And then these 2 animals, or these 2 beings, or humans, Homo erectuses, faced each other, and they seemed to be mating in the middle of the road. And she sat there for 5 minutes watching them.
Oh God.
And then she decided she couldn't sit here all night. She'd better drive around them. So she drove around them, because they're up on her side of the road. And then she stopped right beside them. So they're right outside her passenger window, and you can see them in the full sun, in the full moon, and looking at them again, because she's saying they have to be kangaroos or dogs or something. And then she looks at them, they're looking at her, and she sort of thinks, no, yep, they definitely look like yetis. And then one of them thumped the side of the car. And of course, that gave her a fright, and she accelerated around them, pulled back onto her side of the road, and then stopped. And then she's run over one of them. They're probably kangaroos, just because we have these kangaroos called wallaroos that are very thickly furred. So they can't be yetis. So she stopped and had a look at them again, and still in the full moon of the lights. And one of them was standing up now, because before they'd both been sitting down facing each other, face to face. And so now one was sitting down, one was standing up. And then she looked at them for another few minutes, thinking, well, they still look like yetis. And then she eventually drove away, and thinking, why does weird things happen to me? She thought the whole thing is a negative thing, because it's impossible. But eventually did some wonderful illustrations of them. And she finally, when talking to other people, she began to realize that other people are seeing strange things as well. And then another wonderful encounter where a group of fencing contractors were building a fence up on the Dorrigo Plateau near the town of Dorrigo. And they were there for 9 months, and they put in 28 kilometres of new fencing. The old timber fencing was rotting away after 100 years or so. So they're pulling in steel spikes, steel picket. And 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 the property was actually owned by a British member of Parliament. It was an investment property and a cattle station. So the gentleman that contacted me, he'd been when he started work, they had just begun the very first day of putting in the new pickets. They'd already pulled down the old fencing, and of course they'd moved the cows into another paddock, of course, and this is sort of undulating hilly country dropping down into steep ravines and wilderness. And so they drove up at 6 in the morning, and they see, oh my goodness, one of the cows has got loose because there's a big black animal squatting by the fence. And then it was looking back over its shoulder, and then it stood up on its hind legs and began to run, bent over forward at a 45-degree angle. And this gentleman cried out, "Oh my God, I've never seen a cow run on its hind legs before." Because he's still positive it had to be a cow. And then the other workmen were saying, "That's not a cow. Cows can't run on their hind legs." And they watched it running, and they realised that this was a thing like a gorilla, and it was swinging its arms like pendulums back and forth, and it ran with it. Instead of running the way humans run and walk, we just move the lower part of our leg forward, but this was bringing its knees up high, and the grass was a couple of feet high, and you could see the tops of its knees rising above, and it was bent over at a 45-degree angle, swinging its arms. Had to run about 150 meters. And so anyway, they drove up to where it was, and they'd been pulling out the iron stakes that they had, the iron fence posts, and twisting them. And so they just threw those in the bush and kept on. It
managed to actually twist the metal.
Yeah, it twisted these star pickets,
huge strength.
And so incredibly strong. Anyway, they had to do the job, so and I think it had run away, and they decided they would call these things gorilla men, because that's what they looked like to them. And they encountered them occasionally, and each time they did, they all both ran they've always both ran away. One time they went for a swim at this lovely set of waterfalls, we call Gorilla Man Falls. We've had a couple of expeditions to this area. We often go looking for evidence if we get the opportunity. And they'd gone down to have a swim, and there was a big log that they could hear some animal breaking pieces of old rotted timber out of this big log. This log is about 1.5 meters, so 4, 5, 6 feet across or something, and a hollow inside covered in moss. And they realised some animal was breaking pieces of the timber probably to feed on the various beetle larvae, borers, and so they approached the log, and suddenly one of these gorilla men stood up, and they ran for their life. And one of the poor chaps, he was so terrified that he defecated as he ran. Anyway, eventually one of them turned up at their house. It was a corrugated iron house, and it hammered on the walls, and it pushed the car back and forth, back and forth. They could hear it. They were so terrified of this thing walking around thumping the walls, and that left perfect footprints. And the gentleman that told me the story, he said that they're all in bed at this time. It was late at night, just not long after they'd gone to bed. And so he pulled the blanket over his head and held his breath, and he went unconscious. He woke up the next morning, discovered that one of the workmen had slept the night under a pile of dirty clothes in the laundry, because they were so terrified this thing would break its way in and murder them. And that chap then left. He left the property immediately. He wouldn't have anything to do with the place. So they had several encounters, but of course they're not actually aggressive in that, and that's the reason they're unknown. But they're moving into the towns now. So we get reports in the towns themselves.
Oh, Right
And
on
yes,
the outskirts of the towns, or
right
in
in
the...
the centre of towns. Yeah,
Wow.
at night always. And so I had this husband and wife. They were a reverend and his wife, and in a local church in a town in northern New South Wales. And because they'd heard me on the radio, and they had recorded some calls. They phoned me up and asked me if I'd identify the calls. Anyway, the calls were simply of a female fox, a vixen's call. And then they said, oh, they've also heard these other calls. They haven't been able to record them, but just incredibly loud roars. But they've been having trouble with, they believed it was the neighbour, because almost every night someone would be under the house walking around and thumping on the walls and grabbing the door and twisting the doorknob and climbing up over the house onto the veranda. And they set up security cameras. They'd glare at the neighbour and the neighbour would glare back at them. And they were positive that it must be the neighbour. They'd said to me, how can the neighbour spend all night under a house and then the next day he's working in his garden? You're just a retired gentleman. And I said, it's not the neighbour. It's probably the same thing's happening to him. And he thinks maybe it's you trespassing onto his property. Anyway, they phoned the police many times, telling them they got an intruder. And the policeman told them that, oh, look, this has been going on for 3 years. It's a madman. We've never been able to work out where he lives. And no one's ever seen him in the daytime, but you encounter him at night. He never does any damage, but he wanders around people's gardens and he bangs on walls, and he sometimes he'll move a rock or something or other. And he's anyone who's ever seen him said he's huge and hairy. But of course they think it must be a person. It can't possibly be a relic.
Because that's where your mind would automatically go to. It was interesting to me actually when you mentioned the workmen thinking that they saw a cow on its hind legs, or the lady in the car thinking that she saw 2 giant kangaroos. And I always think about when the Aztecs saw Cortez coming on his ships, and they thought they were floating mountains because there was no frame of reference in their mental library to describe what they were seeing. So your mind makes up something that's not there, but best fits the description to you. When you're listening to witnesses give descriptions of animals they've got no clue about, do you often have those types of things, that this description from the mental library? So we see it with sea monsters a lot in the old reports. The water horse, a horse-like head. Well, it's not a horse-like, but it seems to have this cattle-like shape to it. Do you have a similar thing with the Yowie? What do they say? Do they say Yowie or Bigfoot, or do they normally say things like a large gorilla or chimpanzee or a caveman? How do they describe it?
Yes, look, the image of the animal is seared into their brain, because I mean, if you see something, the same thing if you're going to the shops and suddenly some big thug or dangerous looking character suddenly menaces you, you won't be able to get that figure out of your mind. Or if you see a terrible accident or something, you hear about people that they become quite traumatic because they relive the experience. And so it's similar. But yeah, the description is always almost identical. It's always a huge, incredibly powerfully built, ancient human-like animal, more human than ape or a gorilla-like. But if people that only get a view of the animal running away, they'll say it looked like a gorilla. But if they see the face, invariably they say that it's the face of a human.
And is the face hairy normally, or is there visible skin?
Very much like the Bigfoot description. So generally it's bare around the eyes, but sometimes the whole face can be fairly hairless. And you can see there's quite a bit of individuality, and we've actually got a photograph of one. A gentleman by the name of Ray Doherty. He's got a website called the Australian Yowie Project, and some years ago, he photographed a very dark figure up in a tree from a bit of a distance. He didn't have all that good a camera, and because he wasn't a professional photographer. And then he got very interested in these animals. Now the Aboriginal people, they know them very well. Now, if the Aboriginal people who have been here for, we've got evidence that they've definitely been here 50, 60, 70, 80,000 years. They're probably even older than that. And they say, the Aboriginal people have many names for these ancient human-like creatures. And on the East Coast, they're usually called, the males are doolagals, and the females are marlemas. So doolagals or doolagars and marlemas. But that's just in New South Wales, Eastern New South Wales. They have different names in every part of Australia, because we had about 500 different original Australian nations that were decimated to a large degree with the arrival of the British in the a couple of hundred years ago. However, the original people, generally known as Aboriginal people, right across the tropics and in the inland, where it was too difficult for European-style farming, those people, their culture and their tribes are intact, and they talk about these animals. They know the Tasmanian tigers or thylacines. They know where they live. They keep them as pets sometimes. They know of the Homo erectus-like animal, Homo denisovan. So they're well known to they're very sacred, and they don't generally talk to outsiders, English or Australians or whatever, especially because a lot of people, as we know, unfortunately, a lot of people have very negative attitudes towards other cultures, and so think their culture is wonderful, but think sort of traditional cultures are of no consequence. But of course, fabulous cultures. I mean, you would put down any of the world's cultures, no matter what. All fabulous cultures. But so they know them well. So so they have. Sorry, this Ray Doherty. He was able to get some software that enhanced the photograph he took, and so we now have a photograph of the face of one of these, whatever they are, Homo erectus, or perhaps they're Homo denisovan. The Homo denisovan is known from Siberia, just from 2 or 3 teeth and a finger bone, 40,000 years, interbreeding with humans and Neanderthals about 40,000 years ago in Siberia, and studying the genetics of Australian Aboriginal people. There's something like 4 or 5% of their genetics is denisovan genetics. The same thing in New Guinea, and the same thing with the Sherpa people in the Himalayas, and scattered around amongst a whole bunch of other people. As you probably know, Europeans, we have 1 or 2% Neanderthal DNA in us. So we know that Caucasians or Europeans were interrelating with Neanderthals, Homo Neanderthal, and so the same thing was happening in Asia and Australia or Australasia with Homo denisovan. So the photograph, you can see, it's not something like a gorilla, it's very ancient human. And so now Ray Doherty obtained the services of a wonderful forensics sculpturer, and he's made a life-size 3-dimensional sculpture. His name's Buckingham, and he's made a wonderful 3-dimensional sculpture of the face of this Yowie or doolagal, and you can see it on Ray Doherty's The Australian Yowie Project internet site.
Now, before the bit there's also a smaller creature called the.
Yes, and so if you look in the background here, you can see is an actual reproduction of a doulagal, and that was made by Matteo Camero, our daughter Loana's partner, and you can see that's shows you a bit like what it looks like. So here we have one. I'll just put the light on it. But of course,
and the skin on the face normally describes being very
well. The face looks very gorilla-like, but I mean, this was simply a Christmas present given to me, so just a one-off piece of sculpture. It's not supposed to be exactly like, but this is something like what we're dealing with, and which seems to be increasing in number. And he's even got the voice, so get ready, listen to the voice of the doulagal. No, that's not really its voice, obviously. But we also have, in my scientific paper in the Australian Zoologist, we do in fact have an illustration done from life. There are people that are actually studying these, and I'm going to show you the first illustration done from life of the doulagal, and that's it there. In fact, these are different illustrations, but this one just here, that was done by Pixie Burns, and she was able to watch this Yowie from only about 25 meters away. It sat down in front of her. She was on a slope in the forest, and it emerged into a small clearing. It sat down, and it didn't look at her. It obviously knew she was there. It acted very much like a gorilla, and then it simply stood up and walked away. And then she got to see it on 2 occasions. And you also, and these are the very first illustrations of these animals, unknown to science, ever published in a scientific journal. And of course, we've got no physical evidence for these animals whatsoever, and we won't have until we've got DNA. But look, there's an illustration that was published in 1912, I think it was in the Sydney Sun newspaper, and you'll see it there. That was seen by a group of surveyors, and it's that was the first published illustration, and observed by Charles Harper, published Sydney Sun, 10 November 1912. The Bombala anthropoid, drawn by Will Donald, from a description. Now, encountered in the Curragh Ranges when it approached its campfire at night, moving erect, and then retreated at a faster rate on all fours. So, and I'll just show you
experience
a couple of other interesting things. So, this is the first colour painting. It's a watercolour, and it was done by Diane Smith, and it was based on Pixie Burns' illustration. And so that's the original painting that's now in the Dangerous Ideas in Zoology edition of the Australian Zoologist. So that's the very first colour painting of one of these wonderful animals, probably Homo erectus. Yeah, and then and this is interesting as well. This is a little sculpture called the Yowie of Springbrook, and Springbrook is just north of us. Springbrook is part of one of the world's largest volcanic calderas. It's part of the northern crater wall. It's about 3,300 something like that feet tall, so about 1,000 meters or so. And there's been many detailed close encounters over the decades of the Yowies up there. And so this is a little sculpture that I bought, was sold in a souvenir shop, of the Yowie of Springbrook. So just an interesting little statue. But of course, there's no physical evidence for the existence of these animals. And of course, most people wouldn't believe that they exist under any circumstances until they encounter one, and then they're terribly shocked to discover that something like this is still alive.
Oh, yeah. There's a small
so
different.
Yeah, so we have another species. We have another species. We have 2 or 3 of these relict humans. We don't really know what they are, but we have this smaller species, very well known to the Aboriginal people. And in this locality, it's known as the Nimbinge or Nimbingi, and also known in other localities as Jungides. And it seems to be identical with the fossil human that was discovered on Flores in the eastern archipelago of Indonesia, so just directly north of Australia. And in a large cave there, a number of fossil skeletons of a miniature human, only standing about 3 to 4 feet tall, and it was scientifically named Homo floresiensis.
Oh, yes.
And, yeah, Homo floresiensis.
Do you think it has an identity?
Yes, look, it's definitely here. I'm surprised by the number of phone calls that I get live on air from farmers encountering these amazing miniature humans. And for instance, only a few months ago, while talking live on air, there's a host, of course, on the radio show, and it was Joanne Shoebridge. And a gentleman by the name of Richard phoned up, and you could tell he was originally from England. He had an English accent, and he was an older man, obviously. And he said, "Oh, look, I saw these 3 animals. I want them identified. I haven't seen anything like them in the books or anything. I can't work out what they were." And I said, "Oh, well, tell me what you've seen." He said, "Well, it's I was herding my cattle on horseback." He got a small mob of cattle and he's moving them to another paddock. And so this is in Crabs Creek Valley, and it's all of our valleys. The valley bottoms are cleared, and that's mainly cattle fattening and sugar cane, and also growing various kinds of crops, coffee, tea in the lowlands, and bananas, and macadamia nuts in particular. And then the ranges are covered in forest and nearly always protected as national parks and nature reserves. So it's a very forested environment with the obviously the level lands, the valley bottoms cleared, sugarcane, and assorted crops. So he's herding his cattle. He's got a cattle dog or 2, and they run over to the edge of the forest and start barking at something. So he rides over to see what they're barking at, and he said he was just astounded by what he saw. He said there was 3 animals standing there, and they looked to him just like little hairy humans. And he said one of them was 4 foot high and covered in black hair, and one of them was 3.5 foot high, looked like a female, and it was covered in blonde hair, so sort of a light brown hair or caramel coloured hair. And there was a young one, they had a child, and it was about 3 feet tall. And it was also the same colour as the mother. And then off they ran into the forest. And he said he was absolutely astounded because he never imagined such a thing existed. And so he was talking live on air, knowing that this is the ABC North Coast local radio, just like ABC local radios all over Australia. It's where all of the important government announcements are made, you know, for the weather and farming prices and weather conditions and disasters, floods and fires and other things. So it's the radio station that all the local rural people listen to, and the people in the small towns. And so these farmers that talk about these animals, they know that their neighbours are listening, and sometimes their neighbours will phone up and say, "I've seen exactly the same animal," and so I've had several phone calls and reports. I've gone out and checked out localities. So I had another chap had his dog. He was walking his dog, and Justin was walking his dog, and the dog sat down and was staring very in a very concentrated manner at something, and he sat beside the dog trying to see what it was, and you could see a black animal about 20 meters or so in front of him, and then suddenly it stood up and it ran. He said it was like a gibbon. It had long arms and legs, and it looked to him more like a gibbon than anything. It was about 4 foot high, and it ran very rapidly away. He contacted me, and we went, and we had an explore of the area. There was a nice little patch of rainforest where he saw it. It was right on the edge of suburbia, the small town of Byron Bay. And then I've had several other encounters. A gentleman camping opened when he woke up in the morning, he sees what he thinks a child looking in his tent. Then he realises a little old man, a little hairy man staring at him, and just grunts at him and walks off. A mother and daughter riding their horses, and encountered one in the middle of the day, and black, and it just ran really quick in a zigzag fashion. So it zigzagged away, and probably that's an adaptation to maybe, because they've had to live with the original people for many thousands upon thousands of years, and so maybe that zigzag motion, the way they run, is to avoid being speared or anything. But and then the most amazing encounter, a lady with the name of Laurie at Ganella Bar near Lismore. She spoke about having some friends over and a barbecue, and then they were sitting around the fire. Everyone left, and she, after they left, it was midnight and the fire was just about out. She walked over to a big gum tree on the edge of the property, and bent down to pick up some fallen branches, and she heard someone coming up behind her. And this is about you know, only 20 meters from the, say 20 yards from the fire and the husband, I suppose. And she thought maybe the husband was walking over to give her a hand. The next second, she was grabbed by her hair, by her ponytail, and she was pulled back up to her feet because she was bent right over. And she said, and she was staring face to face, but about 4 foot tall, once again, a blonde-haired, little hairy man staring right at her face to face, and said to her in a very gravelly voice, "No more wood," and then ran in the zigzag fashion away. So that's the first time of anyone's reported actually them communicating directly. And who knows, since they are humans, I mean, this is Homo floresiensis, if this is what it is, and the other's Homo denisovan or Homo erectus. These are highly intelligent hominids, and who knows what abilities they actually have. But the good news is that the reports seem to be increasing. And of course, majority of people do not report sightings. So the various researchers have speculated that there are several sightings every day going on across Australia, and only about 1% report their sightings. So about 99% of people never tell anybody, because if they tell anybody, they get laughed at. If you say, oh, you met a prehistoric human in the woods or something or other, or a Tasmanian tiger, you know, they immediately, people say, oh, you must be drinking or something. And in fact, people that have encountered these animals, they say, oh, whenever they heard anyone encountering one of these unknown animals, they would dismiss it immediately and laugh at them. And then after they had an encounter, everyone now laughs at them. Yeah, so that's the yeah. So then the other animals we received reports of, which is particularly interesting, is the marsupial lion, Thylacoleo carnifex. Now, the marsupial lion is well known in the fossil record, and it was one of the most spectacular predators on Earth, unrelated to cats, but very cat-like. And so once again, the way it's called parallel evolution, because animals adapting to the conditions in a particular locality, but coming from isolated populations unrelated to other populations of animals. Obviously, an animal that feeds on vegetation is liable to end up with a face that looks something like a sheep or a deer or something like that. And so kangaroos have quite deer-like faces. So the Tasmanian tiger or thylacine, even though it's unrelated at all to dogs, looks very dog-like, except it usually has black bars across the back and has a completely different way of walking, has a long stiff tail, and can jump like a kangaroo and run like a dog. So the marsupial lion, it's not related to lions or cats in any way, and in fact it's related to possums. And of course, in our Australian possums or phalangers, quite an array of animals, marsupials with pouches, distantly related to koalas. They are very common in Australia, some of the most common animals. So we have the largest animals are the cuscusses that live in the tropics and in New Guinea, which is a part of Australia. And we have the brush-tailed possums, we have the ring-tailed possums, little tiny possums, only the size of mice, called pygmy possums and honey possums. And then many of the possums have evolved the ability to glide. So just like flying squirrels, we have gliding possums. And so we have greater gliders that are about 1 metre long, or say 3 feet long, look just like a gliding squirrel, but are unrelated to squirrels in any way, true marsupials. And they glide through the trees, and they range from the greater glider, yellow-bellied glider is a little bit smaller. They can travel 100 metres as they glide overhead through the treetops. And then you get squirrel gliders, mahogany gliders, sugar gliders, and little tiny feather gliders, only the size of mice, all gliding around in the trees. So the marsupial lion is distantly related to the possum. So you can imagine a possum, or an opossum, which they have in North and South America, very distantly related, marsupials. This is a lion-sized possum, carnivorous possum. And so it doesn't have canines, it has 2 huge incisors, those front biting teeth, and huge cutting molars. And the fossils are well known up until about 40,000 years ago, when most of the Australian megafauna went extinct. And we don't really know what happened to it, but as we know, the megafauna survived in Africa and India, but it went extinct in Europe with the cave bears and the mammoths and the hairy rhinoceroses and what have you, and all the North and South American megafauna like the giant sloths and the mastodons and the and the cave bears and all the other wonderful animals went extinct around about 12,000 years ago. The Australian megafauna went extinct around about 40,000 years ago, whether it was due to climate change, during the glaciation of the ice ages. So Australia was full of these huge animals. We had huge koalas that were the size of hippos or rhinoceroses, and they're known as diprotodonts, two front teeth. And so distantly related, of course, to koalas and wombats. But we had giant koalas, but really big terrestrial species. We had giant kangaroos, lots of species of giant kangaroos that stood, 3 meters tall. We had the world's largest birds, gigantuous flightless geese that stood about 3 meters tall. We had terrestrial crocodiles. We had the world's largest lizard, the size of an Allosaurus dinosaur. So it's called Varanus pristis, the giant goanna. And we also had these marsupial lions, and also different species of thylacines, powerful thylacines of Tasmanian tigers, much bigger than the ones that survive today. Even little species are only as big as cats. There was big Tasmanian devils, so quite an array of fabulous animals. Giant tortoises with horns on their heads and clubbed tails. And this great array of spectacular animals went extinct mostly around about 40,000 years ago, as far as the evidence, skeletal evidence, is concerned. However, the marsupial lion, or Thylacoleo, Carnifex, there's lots of reports of these animals all over Australia, and there's been books written on them, and it's probably the animal that I saw in 1969 crossing the road. I've got a drawing of it just here.
Let's see that.
And of course that's in my book. So that's what I saw cross the road in 1969. I got a real close view of it.
And is that your sketch, Gary?
Yeah. That's actually a sketch by Jeff Johnson, and he made it from my original sketch. That was my sketch that I did at the time. That's the animal, and whether like the tail might, I think that the tail was, I did it too fluffed up, but it crossed the road slowly right in front of me, and then I sent this picture that I did to Jeff Johnson a decade ago now, I suppose. And
what kind of size was the animal?
And so he did that, and I said, yes, that's pretty much what it looked like. It was the size, around about the size of a very big dog. So as it came out of the vegetation, and I was driving down the road, and of course, I've always been an animal lover. I've always been able to identify all the animals. And so I thought this was a dog coming out of the long grass in the forest. And I thought, look at the head on it, looks like a mastiff or something. And so a big dog-sized. And then as it came out onto the verge, onto the mown grass on the side of the road, I realised, no, that's that's nothing like a dog at all. And the hind legs were moving very much like a possum, brush-tailed possum. You could see it was quite a different animal to anything that we have. And I'd heard of this animal, generally known as the Queensland tiger, because it's banded. It was sort of a brindle colour with the tail was particularly noticeable being banded, and it was the tail was the last thing that I saw. Now that's what, from memory, that's what the tail looked like, but maybe it wasn't as thickly furred as that. But I continued to get reports of this animal. It can be all black, or it can have a banded tail just like that, or it can have very distinctive stripes. And the animal
did you see the tail move, or did it stay perpendicular to the animal throughout the time that you had it in view?
The tail didn't move. It was straight perpendicular behind it, and it didn't wag. You could tell it was nothing like a dog. And I could tell it was definitely a carnivorous marsupial. Because if you live in Australia and you study the wildlife, you know what carnivorous marsupials like. They're wonderful animals. The ones that we know best is the spotted tail quoll, also called tiger quoll or tiger cat, and the native cats. Originally they're called native cats. They're nothing like cats, not related to them. They look a bit more like martens or ferrets or something like that, and very attractive spotted animals, brown with white spots or black with white spots. The eastern quoll, the northern quoll, the western quoll, they're a bit smaller than cats, and they're carnivorous marsupials. Then you get the spotted tail quoll is the largest of them, and so this looked like an enormous version of the spotted tail quoll. And this is an illustration also by Jeff Johnson of one that was actually trapped by a fellow by the name of Arthur Davis at Torrington in 1939. And this is the drawing of what it looked like. And my brother has twice seen this same animal. And he said the ones that he saw twice, that part of the tail there was very thin, but it was brushed out at the end. And many of our marsupials have a brushed tail, like the brush-tailed possums. But he trapped this animal in a rabbit trap. Wow. And he was checking his traps, and suddenly he came across this animal, and this is the animal the size of a very big dog, like a mastiff or something. And it jumped at him, and it swiped at him with its front claws, and it made an amazing call. Interestingly enough, we do have on my Australian Cryptozoology Gary Opit, we do have an amazing call recorded by a lady on her phone. She lives in the forest, on a property surrounded by forest, and she recorded this astounding animal's call. And experts have listened to it and say it's the sound of an animal unknown to science. And it's a really unusual call. You can tell it's a marsupial call. It's nothing like any other animal. And you can listen to it on my Australian Cryptozoology Gary Opit Facebook site. But so it made this very bizarre call. He said he described the call as like the sound of a flock of parrots or something, all taking off, screeching or something. So like, and anyway, so he picked up a log and hit it over the head and knocked it unconscious. And he thought he'd killed it. And so he took it out of the trap, and then he went back to get his car to drive up closer, a car or his horse or whatever, horse and cart. Or this is 1939 in the New England tablelands in central eastern New South Wales. And he went to get his, and he came back because he wanted to take it to the museum. He said, fantastic, I found a new kind of animal. And it was gone. I spent a lot of time trying to hunt one, and it's rocky country, and he said he got to see one, and it was another individual. It wasn't the same one that he'd trapped, before he could shoot it, it jumped several meters and disappeared down a crevice into the rocks. So so this animal is being reported all over Australia again and again, and it often seems to be jet black, and so people tend to think it's a black panther. But if they get a really close look at it, they realise it's not black panther at all. It's sort of, they said the head's more like a bear or something. And amazingly enough,
do you think many of your black panther sightings in Australia could actually be of this animal?
Yes, I think a lot of them are. There's a researcher in Victoria, and that's his conclusion. And he's seen this animal on several occasions. And he's got a Facebook site called Thylacoleo Lives. Thylacoleo Lives, from memory. Wonderful. And he's got a book of that same name. But this animal was actually photographed in 1964. It was photographed in 1964 in Western Victoria. So here's an actual photograph. And I saw this first published in the newspapers when I cut it out as a clipping. I thought, oh my goodness, fancy. an unknown species of animal, and so this is probably the best photograph ever taken of an animal unknown to science, and this animal is still being seen today.
Wow.
And almost certainly it's Thylacoleo carnifex, the marsupial lion. Though, of course, we don't know. There's no physical evidence whatsoever. But so anyway, in Western Victoria, this the lady that saw this was Rilla Martin, and she was visiting her cousin on a farm in Western Victoria, and she and while she was visiting there, they were talking about a large striped animal that people had seen, but no one knew what it was. They knew it wasn't a tiger, but it was an unknown animal. And there'd been many reports of Tasmanian tigers, so that people thought maybe it's a Tasmanian tiger. And there's even evidence to show that people visiting Tasmania brought back Tasmanian tigers as pets, and they're exhibited and may have even been released. And it's believed a researcher by the name of Michael Moss, I believe his name is, he believes that Tasmanian tigers or thylacines are actually purposely reintroduced into the into a national park in Victoria. But anyway,
Wow.
she was driving back to Melbourne from the farm, and there was some lovely flowers on the wildflowers growing on the side of the road. She said, "I'll take a photograph of those flowers." So she took out a box brownie camera, and she was about to take the photograph when she said suddenly this animal just suddenly leapt into view and stood there just for a few seconds, and she clicked the picture of it, and then it made another jump and was gone. And
Wow.
So anyway, when she got the film developed, she sent it to her cousin, his name Bushy, his nickname, and she wrote a letter saying, this. You wouldn't believe it. I saw that animal that you were talking about. Here's a picture of it. So he was amazed, and he sent the photograph to the local newspaper, the Wimmera Times, and they published it. The striped animal's finally been photographed, and then it was picked up by the regional or the state newspapers, and then pretty much forgotten about. And other people say,
Sure.
"Oh no."
Sure, I've never ever heard of it actually. So
yes,
it
was seen in a place called Ozenkadnook, so they call it the Ozenkadnook tiger, and some people say, "Oh no, they must have made a model and they set it up or something," and Rilla Martin and the cousin has said, "Well, we wouldn't waste our time doing something like that." People that try to make out these animals don't exist because that they live in the city and they know that milk comes from supermarkets and there's nothing out there.
And that's the general consensus everywhere, even here in Britain, is that people actually in the cities have a very poor concept of the environment that exists within their own country. Gary, just before we finish up, because we kind of come to the end of the segment, which of the animals that you've researched over the years, unknown animals or thought to be extinct animals, do you think is the most likely to be discovered in the next 10 years or so?
Oh, look, very possibly any one of those ones I've been talking about could be discovered at any time. The way they'll be discovered, probably most likely, because very difficult because all these animals live in very small numbers in large territories because they're all carnivores. The Ozenkadnook tiger. Recently, I got a report. A woman said, her father, I think it was, or her uncle, they shot one of these animals. They dragged it into the house, put it on the dining room table. Said, "Look at that! Look, there's an animal unknown. No one's ever seen one of those before." And then they threw it back into the paddock. Like because most people, they're not really, they go, "Oh, there's an interesting animal," and then they're not. But so the only way to really find out if these animals are real, because, and as I've said before, we've got no physical evidence whatsoever. However, we don't get any reports of unicorns or other mythical beasts. You know, no one sees demons. They watch hundreds of films and TVs with every kind of alien and demon and you know, we've got unicorns and fairies.
There's no
and
minotaurs wandering around the country, basically.
No, exactly.
Griffins
The
and minotaurs. Yeah,
that's right. The reports are always of animals, and then look, these days, our study of genetics and DNA in particular, as you know, it's now thankfully very difficult to commit a crime. And if there's a cold case, you look at the DNA and you study the DNA, where once you couldn't do that, and you find, oh, you can identify the actual individual and bring them to justice that may have committed a murder or some crime years before. And of course, as we know, everywhere we go, we leave our DNA everywhere. And that's why you can solve these crimes. And so now marine and aquatic biologists, for instance, are doing studies where they take a bottle of water from a river or a creek or a lake, and they can identify the DNA of any animal that's drunk from that or lived in it. And so I believe there's a study being undertaken at Loch Ness at the moment, because if the Loch Ness animal exists, there'll definitely be DNA from Loch Ness animals. And you said about Loch Ness, Rex and Heather Gilroy, really they're the grandparents of Australian cryptozoology. They were the people, they live in the Blue Mountains, that dedicated their life to and still doing exactly the same thing, began putting out newspaper articles asking for reports of these animals because they were receiving the reports. They set up 3 different museums over time, natural history museums, because they're also interested in butterflies and insects, and what have you, and they've received hundreds of reports. And interestingly enough, they've received many reports of a very plesiosaur or Loch Ness monster type animal living in the Hawkesbury River. And they've published books on them. So Australia has there's quite a few researchers, and they've published some wonderful books. And if you're interested in the Loch Ness monster, well, this river of monsters is well worth having a look at. And you can just go online and Uru Publications, Rex and Heather Gilroy, they have a site. We all get together every year and speak at the Australian Cryptozoological Research Organisation conference every year around about 9th of September in Newcastle, just north of Sydney. If you ever get a chance, you're in Australia, come along. It goes for 2 days. I'm always speaking, and Rex and Heather Gilroy speak. And they've picked up hundreds of reports of a plesiosaur-like animal, and even have illustrations, photographs of cave paintings, and they've even seen what looks like the animal. And then the most astounding, and it's well known to the Aboriginal people. Again, there's rock carvings of it. The Aboriginal people call it Miralina. But the most astounding animal that they've been able to receive reports of is a surviving species of dinosaur.
Oh, wow.
And this is called Burrunjaw. And this is a true one of the tyrannosaurids, right, surviving today. And they've picked up quite a few reports of it living in the remote tropical north of Australia. Now, Australia, for those that haven't seen Australia, and even most Australians haven't had anything to do with much of the outback, you can imagine Australia, say, like the United States was 200 or 300 years ago. So we've got most of the population live in just 2 or 3, 4 cities on the east coast or southeast coast. And then there's one big city up in Darwin, and in one city in the where, say, Los Angeles is in North America. So you can imagine one city, you know, up at Denver, say, and in one city, Florida, Miami, and then, you know, New York and Boston or something or other.
Very sparsely populated.
Very sparsely, 25 million people. The whole thing is forested.
Wow.
And these reports of this Burrunjaw, this is the Aboriginal name for it. Now, I've had no reports of this, and I have no idea if this animal exists or not. I have absolutely no idea. This is purely from the work of Rex and Heather Gilroy, but they've done a wonderful job, and they've been astounded by what reports they've received. But people that have seen these, that have just claimed to have seen them, they generally stockmen, and it's a kind of animal, if you encounter it, it's very unlikely you will live to tell the tale. However, you'd think, oh, look, it's impossible that something like this could exist, and it's pretty much what I would say as well. I find it hard to believe. However, you never know. And if this amazing animal has survived, and I mean, these dinosaurs, they weren't the monsters that they're made out to be in sort of Jurassic Park or whatever. So if say a Tyrannosaurid-like dinosaur survived to the present, it would have lived for thousands of years with Aboriginal people, with humans, with people, with brilliant hunters, and it would spear it at the first opportunity they would to defend themselves. So you can imagine something like this, if it survived, and I mean, I think you'd imagine it's highly unlikely. However, you can imagine if something like this did survive, it's nocturnal, it's mainly seen at night. It would live, and it doesn't know, like any carnivores, we might be frightened of carnivores or whatever, but they don't know they're big and terrifying. You know, same with someone might meet you in the street and regard you, oh my God, you know, you're a frightening looking person, or just meet me and go, oh my God, look at him. But in actuality, you and I might be quite meek or mild. The same thing with something like this. It doesn't know it's big and terrifying. It would be conserving energy. It would be sleeping during the daytime, a solitary hunter, and then it would be feeding mainly on kangaroos and kangaroos and emus. But these days it have huge supplies of wild cattle and donkeys and horses and camels and goats and pigs, and of course, like all animals, all carnivores especially, they conserve energy. So it would know where its prey is. It would go out. It would grab itself something to eat, like a wild pig or something. It would consume it and go back to its den and sleep. Now, you would think that there's no chance of this possibly existing, and I find it very hard to believe that such a thing could exist. You know, naturally you think it's more likely Tasmanian tigers might have survived because we know they exist. It's hard to believe that Homo erectus, Yowies or Doolittle survived.
I mean, all of these things are hard to believe, but there's so many other things that we found difficult to believe that we now know to be true, like the gorilla. I was making a joke to somebody just the other day about the giant squid. That was the kraken at some point. And now it's just there in a museum and you can go and see it. And there's the kraken lying in formaldehyde.
That's right.
Your observation. Gary, I'm going to finish the show here if we come to the end of the segment. But what I would just like you to tell people is where can they find you, and how can they get involved in your work if they want to help in some way?
Yes, if they're interested, anyone's interested in reporting what they've seen, and I always point out, I could denigrate people. You know, people that phone me up and or send me emails or whatever, I could say, oh, you're an idiot or something. Don't, but I mean, I wouldn't do that because I'm fascinated by what people are seeing, and I'm also interested, like, if there was no DNA, if we discover that there isn't any DNA, then it's also interesting because why are people seeing something? Are they hallucinating? Have we got a large numbers of people who are just terrible liars and happy to fabricate things? You mentioned once earlier, I actually found and describe in that in my scientific paper, Citizen Science and Cryptozoology, results of 18 years of wildlife radio, that up at the Gymnast State Forest in southeast Queensland, that's sort of north of Brisbane, I was taken out there by a couple of researchers who had found all of these unusual tree tears or marks on trees. And I went and had a look, and that's one of the things that I talk about in that scientific study. I found about 500 examples of where an unknown animal had been feeding on wood-boring longhorned or longicorn beetle larvae, and had been using there was always on these green wattles, it was around about a metre or less above ground. We have yellow-tailed black cockatoos that rip timber apart to feed on these grubs, generally referred to as witchetty grubs, some of the species. It's an original people's, an Australian people's delicacy for thousands of years. But there was no sign of tool use. You could see what looked like thumbnail impressions or fingernail impressions in the bark, and always a strip of timber had been peeled. First the bark had been peeled up, and then the timber had been pulled out, and exposing the burrow of this wood-boring beetle larva, and then there was no bite marks or anything. It was very neatly done, and then the grub had been obviously taken out, possibly by inserting a fingernail, because only a small section of the burrow beneath in the timber had been exposed. So that's the only physical evidence that I found that and I said in my scientific paper, I'd love somebody to tell me what kind of animal is responsible for this. But what was seen was definitely a yowie, or one of these relict hominids, as they're often called. Maybe it was a Jungidae, but these people that took me to this site, and I never heard or saw anything, but I saw all these everywhere I looked. There was this evidence of this unusual predation on these wood-boring grubs, but they had heard a chattering sound or call, and they had actually disturbed in the night while spotlighting an animal that looked like a black primate that ran off on its hind legs. So, a yowie or a Jungidae or whatever. But yeah, it's a very interesting continent. There's whole mountain ranges that have hardly been explored. Even in the Sydney district, you go up to the Blue Mountains, only a couple of hours west of Sydney, or an hour and a half or something by train or car, up to Katoomba, and go to Echo Point and the Three Sisters and look out, and just look at that country. There's vast areas, the wilderness, all protected in National Park, and that's just the beginning of it. Stretches right across the continent. Large areas have been cleared, of course, for cattle grazing and farms, but anywhere that it's further away, more rugged or poorer country, a lot of it's sandstone. There's vast areas that perhaps some wonderful unknown animals still surviving today. So yeah, and you can contact me. My email address is Gary Opit, GaryOpit, Gary Opit @gmail.com. And as I said, I've got a Gary Opit.
Observing just the legs is
yeah,
quite
you just saw the legs.
experience. Yeah.